Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive here. Today, we're going to be looking at something that I think affects a lot of people, and that's the impact of trauma. You, our listeners, brought us a really diverse collection of sources. I mean, we're talking everything from, kind of big societal issues down to some really personal stories of struggle. So what we want to do today is really get into just how deep the impact of these experiences can be. What are the marks that these experiences leave on us? And then kind of where do we go from there? How do we understand healing? And we're not just talking about the kind of emotional and psychological scars here. We're also going to be looking at some of the surprising ways that trauma can affect us physically. How it changes our brains and our bodies, and even the way that we connect with other people.
Yeah, one thing that really jumps out from the sources you all sent in is just how broadly we can think about this idea of trauma, right? I mean, obviously there's the big events, the violence and the really terrible things that happen, but there's also this whole other side to it, the more subtle but ongoing stuff, like neglect, emotional abuse, even just witnessing trauma within a family. And what really becomes clear from all this is that the effects of these experiences they go way beyond, just how we feel in the moment.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
this is not just, in your head, so to speak. We're talking about biological changes,
Yeah.
real measurable stuff. And that's actually something we'll be talking about a lot today, how trauma can literally reshape our brains, can affect
Mhm.
our physical health, and it can change the very fabric of our relationships
Mhm.
in ways that people might not expect. But first, I think it's good to get a sense of just how widespread these experiences really are.
Mhm.
You know, how common is trauma?
I think the statistics are really eye-opening here. The CDC research that you all shared, it really puts the scale of this issue into perspective. I mean, just think about this for a second. About 1 in 5 Americans, they've been sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4, they've been beaten by a parent, badly enough to leave a mark. And we're talking about physical violence happening in like 1 out of every 3 couples. On top of that, a quarter of us, we grew up with a relative who is struggling with alcohol addiction, and about 1 in 8, they've witnessed their mother being physically assaulted.
It's a lot. It's heavy stuff. And when you hear those numbers, I mean, it really paints a picture of how common these kinds of experiences are. This is happening all around us. And some of the research points out, human beings, we are resilient. But these things, these events, they don't just vanish. They leave their mark.
Yeah.
And not just on individuals, potentially across generations. I mean, that's kind of a thought, right? That the trauma of our parents or grandparents, it could still be affecting us today.
That's right. These numbers, they tell us something really important. It's not just a personal thing. It's a public health issue. I
Mhm.
mean, childhood adversity, it has a ripple effect. And it ends up costing us all in healthcare costs, in crime, in lost productivity. And those marks you talked about, they show up in all sorts of ways. Your sources, they talk about the impact on our emotions, on how we think, on our ability to feel joy or to connect with people intimately. Heck, even on our basic biology and our immune systems. It's like this whole body impact.
Yeah, no. It's a lot to dig in. And I think, sometimes it helps to kind of ground these ideas in a real
Mhm.
story, to see how this actually plays out in someone's life. And one of the sources you all sent talks about a guy named Tom. Now, on the surface, this guy, he seemed to have it all.
Yeah.
The valedictorian in high school, decorated Marine, served in Vietnam, went on to college, law school, built a successful practice, had a wife, 2 kids. Like,
There was a big bug
singular
down the
success,
road.
right?
Yeah, I mean, from the outside, you'd look at Tom and think, wow, what a story of resilience. You know, Here's a guy who faced hardship. I mean, serving as a platoon leader in Vietnam, facing danger, that had to build a sense of competence, the ability to just push through. And he came home, met all the expectations, built a career, a family. It's impressive.
Right. Except, under the surface, under all that success, there was this deep sense of disconnect. Like his wife, she had written him letters while he was in Vietnam, and he said they were a real comfort to him back then. But when he got back, he couldn't feel anything for her, like real affection.
Yeah.
You know, he described it as just going through the motions, like being dead inside. And that really stuck with me because it shows you, trauma can be hidden. It can be lurking beneath this perfect facade.
Exactly. That feeling of being dead inside, the numbness, that's a huge red flag when it comes to trauma. And for Tom, it was like he wanted to love his family. He really did. But he just couldn't get there emotionally. He felt distant. He even said it felt like his heart was frozen, and that extended to how he saw himself too. Like he was just watching his own life go by, no real sense of purpose, no direction, despite all the outward success.
Yeah, it's like this huge disconnect, right, between what's happening on the outside and what's going on inside. And the sources you all sent in, there's another example that really illustrates this. It's about a guy named Bill, and he had this really intense flashback during a Rorschach test.
Oh, yeah, Bill's story. That's a powerful one. It really shows you how trauma, it doesn't stay in the past. It can come back to haunt you. And for him, it was 10 years after witnessing this horrific event in Vietnam. A child was killed. And just seeing an ink blot during a psych test, something totally random, it triggered a full-blown flashback. And it wasn't just a memory. It was like he
Yeah.
was right back there. The sights, the smells, the physical sensations, all of it.
Wow. That's intense. I mean, it really makes you realize that this isn't just, something you remember. It can become your present reality.
Yeah.
And it can be triggered by almost anything. It really makes you wonder how we used to understand this stuff. Like, how was trauma even approached, in the field of psychiatry?
Yeah, that's a good question. And from what your sources say, it seems like early on, there wasn't a lot of focus on trauma. Like, it wasn't really seen as a root cause for a lot of mental health issues.
Mhm.
And there was this stark contrast, between these formal, kind of detached discussions that doctors would have versus what they called midnight confessions, like when patients would finally open up and talk about these really heavy experiences, assault, abandonment, neglect, rape, witnessing violence in their families. And the thing is, over half of the people seeking psychiatric care, they had these kinds of stories. That's a huge number.
Yeah. So basically, they were focusing on the symptoms, like suicidal thoughts, self-destructive behaviors. But they weren't really digging into the why, the root causes,
Mhm.
which, in many cases was trauma.
Right. They were looking at the what, but not the why. And what's interesting is that the sources also point out that they weren't really paying attention to people's strengths either. Their accomplishments, their hopes, their relationships, the things that gave them peace. It was all about the pathology, the
Right.
symptoms, not the whole person.
It seems like a pretty limited view, right? So
Right.
thankfully, things started to change. And researchers started to uncover the biological impact of trauma, like literally how it affects our brains. And that's where we really start to see some hard evidence for the lasting effects of these experiences.
Absolutely. Your sources talk about this area of the brain called Broca's area. It's basically the speech center. And what they found was that during flashbacks, this area can literally go offline, like temporarily shut down. And that's huge because it's like, it's visual proof that trauma can have a physical effect on the brain, similar to like a stroke or a lesion. And that's why people in the middle of a flashback, they often struggle to put what they're experiencing into words. It's like this speechless horror.
Wow. I mean, that's a really powerful image. There's a vital part of your brain just shutting down because of trauma. And it's not just about speech. The body's stress response system, that gets thrown out of whack too.
You got it. Hormones like adrenaline, they're crucial for our survival. It's our fight or flight response. But in people who've been through trauma, this system, it gets all messed up. Like the stress hormones, they take way longer to return to normal after perceived threat. And they can spike like crazy, even when there's no real danger. And over time, that chronic stress, it wreaks havoc on the body. Memory problems, trouble focusing, irritability, sleep disturbances, you name it. It can even lead to long-term health issues, depending on the person's vulnerabilities.
So basically, the body's stuck in this like high alert mode, even when there's nothing to be afraid of. And that constant state of arousal, it can lead to some pretty heavy psychological defense mechanisms, like numbing and depersonalization.
Yeah, depersonalization, that's a big one. It's basically where you feel detached from yourself and your surroundings, like you're watching your own life from the outside. And what's really strange is that people with depersonalization, they can describe these horrific events, but without any emotion. It's like they've shut down completely. And that makes therapy really difficult because you're trying to connect with someone who's essentially checked out. And there's brain imaging that actually shows this happening. Like during these states, almost the entire brain shows reduced activity. It's literally tuning out.
Hmm.
So in that state, you can't think deeply, you can't feel fully, you can't access memories. It's like, how do you even begin to process what happened?
Right. It's like the brain's trying to protect itself. But in doing so, it's actually preventing healing. And then there's another layer to all this, because trauma doesn't just affect our inner world, it messes with our ability to connect with others, like our capacity for social engagement.
And that brings us to the ventral vagal complex, or VVC for short. Think of it like your brain's social engagement system. It's what allows you to feel safe and connected with other people. Like, think about a mother playing with her baby, or the way we move together when we dance, or the harmony of voices when we sing. It's all about feeling in tune. But when trauma happens, this system, it can get overloaded. Like imagine a child who's crying for comfort, but they're ignored, or a child who witnesses violence, or someone trapped in an abusive situation and they can't escape. It's like their system goes into overdrive and then crashes. And that's when the dorsal vagal complex, or DVC, takes over. And that's where you get that freeze response. Heart rate slows down, breathing becomes shallow, you feel faint, you might even collapse.
So basically, the very system that's supposed to help us connect with others, it becomes a source of disconnection. And that can have some pretty serious consequences. Like,
Hmm.
the ACE study found that women who were abused or neglected as children, they were way more likely to be raped as adults.
Hmm.
And children who saw their mothers being assaulted, they were also at higher risk of being victimized later on. It's like their internal alarm system is broken. They can't tell what's safe and what's dangerous.
Exactly. And it's not just the big T trauma either,
Hmm.
the physical and sexual abuse, the chronic emotional stuff, the neglect, that can be just as devastating. Like, there's this woman, Sherry, in one of your sources, and she was successful academically, but she was also incredibly isolated. She described her life as joyless, and she had a history of, really terrible things happening. She was kidnapped and raped at one point. And when she called her mother for help, her mother just refused to talk to her. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it shows just how deeply damaging that lack of emotional support can be.
Right. And all that early trauma, especially the chronic stuff, it seems to target the parts of the brain that are responsible for self-awareness.
Yeah, there's this network of brain regions, the orbital prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the posterior cingulate, and the insula. It's like this mohawk of self-awareness, as some people call it. And in people with chronic trauma, these areas tend to show less activity, which means they have a harder time understanding their own emotions, recognizing their bodily sensations, figuring out what's important to them. And there are brain scans that show this. Like in PTSD patients who experience severe trauma early in life, these areas are much less active. It's like their ability to feel and understand themselves is diminished.
It's like they're cut off from their own internal experience.
Yeah.
And that ability to feel our bodies, to notice what's going on inside, it's so basic. But it's also essential for our sense of self, right?
Absolutely. There's this concept called the proto-self. It's basically the idea that our sense of self is rooted in these bodily sensations, and it's all happening below the level of conscious thought. It's like, you don't have to think about breathing or digesting your food. Your body just does it. But these sensations, they're always there. They're informing our sense of who we are, where we begin and end in the world. And trauma, it can disrupt all of that.
So it's not just about the event itself. It's about the impact it has on our ability to just be in our bodies, to feel ourselves.
Yeah.
And one of the sources you all sent in, it brought up an interesting point about the role of environment versus, the specific experience of trauma. Like they compared kids who were abused to kids who lived in violent neighborhoods.
Yeah. Right. Right. And that's an important distinction because even the kids who were exposed to violence, who saw terrible things, they still reacted differently to certain stimuli than the kids who were abused. Like, for example, they showed them ink blots and a picture of a pregnant woman. And the abused kids, their responses were much more agitated, more preoccupied with themes of violence and danger. It suggests that being the target of abuse, it does something different to you. It leaves a different kind of mark even if you're surrounded by violence, it's the betrayal of trust, the violation within a relationship that seems to be the most damaging.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like, if the people who are supposed to love and protect you are the ones hurting you, that really shakes your foundation.
Yeah.
And that brings us to this whole area of attachment and attunement, which is basically about how our early relationships shape how we connect with people throughout our lives.
Yeah, there was some groundbreaking work done in this area. Bowlby, Bion, Guntrip, Fairbairn, Winnicott. These guys, they really revolutionized how we understand relationships.
Yeah.
And the basic idea is that our very first interactions, with our caregivers, they lay the groundwork for all our future relationships. And our sense of self, it develops through those early back and forth exchanges. Like that's how we learn to trust, to feel safe, to regulate our emotions. And the idea of a secure base, that's crucial. It means having a caregiver who's consistently there for you, who responds to your needs.
Right. And that secure base is built through attunement. It's like this dance between parent and child where they're in sync emotionally. There's delight, there's rupture, and then there's repair.
Yeah, you got it. It's not about being perfect,
Mhm.
Every parent messes up sometimes. But the important thing is the repair. Like the caregiver recognizing that they messed up and then trying to reconnect with the child to get back in sync. And Winnicott, he talked about this idea of the good enough mother. It doesn't mean she's perfect, but she's good enough. And if a caregiver consistently fails to tune in to their baby, to really see them and understand their needs, it can have lasting consequences. It's like the child learns to ignore their own feelings, their own internal experience, and they might develop this sense that there's something wrong with them.
So secure attachment, it's about feeling safe and seen. It's about having that reliable base to explore the world from. And when that's missing, we can develop what are called insecure attachment styles, like anxious attachment or avoidant attachment. And those patterns can stick with us into adulthood.
Yeah, that's right. And those insecure attachment styles, they can create all sorts of problems in relationships because you're basically operating from this place of fear and insecurity. And it can be really hard to break those patterns because they're so ingrained, it's like they become part of who you are. And kids who don't feel safe early on, they often struggle with regulating their emotions. They might be more aggressive, more withdrawn, and their bodies are often in a state of stress. Like their heart rate's elevated, their stress hormones are pumping, and that can be really hard to shake, even if they end up in a safe environment later on.
It's like the body learns to be on guard all the time. And that brings us to this idea that trauma can make it hard to communicate our inner experiences. Like, it can even make us feel like we're not real.
Yeah, there's this quote from Bowlby that really gets at this. He said, "What cannot be communicated to the mother cannot be communicated to the self." It's like if you can't share your experience with a safe and loving caregiver, it becomes trapped inside you. And it can lead to this really profound sense of disconnection from yourself. Like you're not fully real. And in some cases, people will actually hurt themselves, cut themselves, burn themselves, because it's the only way they can feel anything. It's a really desperate attempt to connect with their own bodies, to feel alive.
It's heartbreaking. And then there's the fragmentation of memory, like the way that trauma can shatter our memories and make it difficult to piece things back together.
Yeah.
One of your sources talks about this woman, Marilyn, who was sexually abused as a child.
Yeah.
And during the abuse, she would focus on the wallpaper, like intensely study every detail.
That's a classic example of dissociation, where your mind just detaches from what's happening to protect itself. It's like the pain is too much to bear, so you find something else to focus on, anything to escape the reality of what's happening. And for Marilyn, it was the wallpaper. And the sad thing is her mother didn't believe her, which just compounded the trauma. And that's something that often happens with traumatic memories. They're not like regular memories. They're fragmented, disorganized, like you might remember vivid details. But the order of events, the context, it's all jumbled up.
So it makes it really hard to make sense of what happened, to put the pieces together. And, Freud talked about this thing called the compulsion to repeat, like this unconscious drive to replay dramatic scenarios in an attempt to gain control. But your sources suggest that it doesn't really work that way. Like it often just leads to more pain. And there's another story in your sources about a woman named Nancy who had this really traumatic experience with anesthesia awareness during surgery.
Oh, yeah, Nancy's story. That's a tough one. She had this fragmented memory of being awake during surgery, but she couldn't remember everything. And she kept trying to, like, piece it together to make sense of what happened. But it was really distressing. And it shows you how trauma, it can keep pulling you back into the past. But the good thing is, with her next surgery, she was much more proactive. She met with the surgical team, she asked for support, and that's a sign of recovery. Like, she's starting to take control. And later on, she started seeing a psychodynamic therapist and she got into Pilates. And those things, they really helped her. And she had this realization, that she didn't need to remember every single detail to heal. She said, there are so many pieces of that 45 minutes of my life that remain unknown. My memories are still incomplete and fragmented, but I no longer think that I need to know everything in order to understand what happened. And she also talked about this pull to the past. Like, the pull to the past is strong. It is the dark side of my life, and I must dwell there from time to time. The struggle may also be a way to know that I survive, a replaying of the fight to survive, which apparently I won but cannot own. It's really powerful.
It's like she's finding a way to live with the trauma without letting it define her. And that brings us to the limitations of traditional diagnostic models,
Yeah.
like the DSM.
Yeah, the DSM. It's basically the Bible of mental disorders. And it's been really influential. It's used for insurance, for research, for just understanding mental health in general. But the sources you all sent, they raise this question. Has it actually helped patients? Like, especially people who have experienced complex trauma where it's not always clear cut, you know?
And one of the most telling findings, it came from a really simple question. Was there anybody who you felt safe with growing up?
hmm
And a quarter of the patients, they couldn't think of anyone. I mean, that's just devastating. To not have a single person you felt safe with as a child.
It's heartbreaking. It really speaks to this fundamental human need for connection,
Yeah.
for safety. And that's actually one of the reasons why there was this push to introduce developmental trauma disorder, or DTD, into the DSM.
So what is DTD? And why was it so important to try to get it included in the DSM?
Well, the idea behind DTD was to create a diagnosis that specifically addressed the effects of chronic childhood trauma. Because PTSD, it's usually about a single traumatic event, but for a lot of people, the trauma is ongoing, it's relational, and it leads to this whole complex set of symptoms, problems with emotional regulation, physical symptoms, cognitive difficulties, behavioral issues, trouble with relationships. And the people who were pushing for DTD, they were saying, look, this is affecting a huge population, and we need a way to recognize it and treat it.
It makes sense. It's about seeing the whole picture
Yeah.
and not just focusing on isolated symptoms. And that brings us to the ACE study, which was this really groundbreaking piece of research, and it actually started by accident.
Oh, yeah. The ACE study, that's a fascinating story. It all started in an obesity clinic. Dr. Vincent Felitti, he was working with these patients who were losing a ton of weight, but then they would drop out of the program.
Yeah.
And it wasn't because they weren't successful, it was because the weight loss was triggering all this emotional distress. And he started to realize that a lot of his patients, they had experienced some pretty serious trauma in their childhood, and that led him to this groundbreaking discovery. There's a strong connection between adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and all sorts of health and social problems later in life, like everything from heart disease and cancer to addiction and mental illness.
Wow. I mean,
But
that's huge. It's saying that our early experiences, they can literally shape our health for our entire lives. And it really highlights the importance of social support and early intervention.
oh, absolutely. Social support, it's not a luxury. It's a necessity. It's like we're wired for connection. And when that connection is broken, it throws everything off. And the thing is, the US, we're kind of behind the curve when it comes to supporting families. Like other developed countries, they offer much more in terms of parental leave, childcare, things like that. And there's research that shows that investing in early childhood programs, it pays off big time. Like there's this economist, James Heckman, he found that high quality early childhood programs, they can actually save money in the long run because they lead to lower crime rates, higher earnings, all sorts of positive outcomes. And then there's this guy, David Olds, he developed this home visitation program where nurses go into homes and support families. And the results are amazing. Less child abuse, kids doing better in school, less crime, more people employed. It's like if we can just support families early on, it can make a world of difference.
It's like we're finally starting to understand how interconnected everything is. From our earliest experiences to our physical health to our relationships to how we function in society. And it's fascinating to look back at how our understanding of trauma has evolved over time. Like, there was this guy, Jean-Martin Charcot, who was working with patients with hysteria back in the 1800s.
Yeah, Charcot, he was a pioneer. And he had this idea that trauma could be stored in the body, like as physical symptoms. And he called it embodied memory. Like the body remembers what the mind can't or won't. And one of his famous cases was this guy, Lelog, who developed paralysis in his arm after a car accident. But there was no physical injury, it was all psychological. And then, during the war, they started to recognize the psychological impact of combat. They called it shell shock back then. But there was also a lot of resistance to acknowledging it. Like, they didn't want to believe that soldiers could be so deeply affected by what they saw and experienced. And it's interesting, because the Nazis actually burned all the copies of this book, All Quiet on the Western Front, because it depicted the horrors of war so realistically. It's like they were trying to erase the trauma.
Wow. It's like throughout history, we've struggled to face the reality of trauma. But thankfully, we're getting better at it. And there are all these new therapeutic approaches emerging that go beyond traditional talk therapy.
Yeah, there's EMDR, neurofeedback, body-based therapies, even using theater as a therapeutic tool. And they all have different ways of approaching trauma. But one of the common threads is this idea of restoring balance, like between the rational part of our brain and the emotional part, and helping people expand their window of tolerance, which is basically the range of emotions they can handle without getting overwhelmed or shutting down. And of course, the therapeutic relationship, that's crucial in any kind of therapy, feeling safe and understood by the therapist.
So it's not just about talking about the trauma, it's about finding ways to process it on a deeper level. And a lot of these newer approaches, they really emphasize the body, the connection between our physical sensations and our emotional experiences.
Absolutely. Touch is so powerful. It can be incredibly healing, but it has to be safe touch. And some of the more traditional trauma therapies, like exposure therapy, they can be really intense. And for some people, it's just too much, especially for people who've experienced chronic trauma. And there's some really interesting research happening with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It's basically using MDMA in a therapeutic setting to help people access their trauma memories without getting overwhelmed. And there's this idea that healing often involves telling the truth about what happened, integrating those split off parts of ourselves, and finding ways to create safety in our bodies, like literally feeling safe in our own skin. And there's this woman, Maggie, in one of your sources. She did EMDR therapy, and she had this really powerful experience where she was able to remember her childhood trauma, but she was able to do it from an adult perspective, with compassion and understanding. And it was really transformative for her. And EMDR, it's been controversial, but it's actually really effective for treating trauma, especially single incident trauma in adults. And another thing that's important to remember is that trauma can get trapped in the body as tension, like chronic muscle tension from always being on guard. And that can lead to all sorts of physical problems like chronic pain, headaches, digestive issues. It's all connected.
So we're not just minds, right? We're bodies too. And our bodies hold the memory of what we've been through. And there's this model called internal family systems, or IFS, that talks about the mind as having different parts, like different subpersonalities with their own needs and perspectives.
Yeah.
And the idea is that through mindfulness, we can learn to get to know these parts and integrate them so that we're not constantly at war with ourselves.
Yeah, IFS is a really interesting model, and it's been helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then there's experiential therapies like psychomotor therapy, which is all about using movement and physical expression to process trauma.
And how does that work? Like, what does psychomotor therapy actually look like?
So psychomotor therapy, it uses movement and physical expression to help people process trauma. It can involve things like dance, role playing, working with clay. It's really about getting out of your head and into your body. And it can be really powerful for people who have trouble talking about their experiences because it gives them a way to express themselves non-verbally. And it can also help them to create new experiences, new memories that can counteract the negative ones. Like, there's this story in one of your sources about a woman named Maria who was abused by her father. And in therapy, she would act out scenes with a therapist who was playing the role of her real father. And it was really intense, but it allowed her to express all this rage and pain that she had bottled up inside. And it was really cathartic for her.
That's amazing. It's like through the body, she was able to rewrite her story.
Uh-huh.
And then there's neurofeedback, which is this really cool technology that can actually train brainwave patterns.
Yeah, neurofeedback is fascinating. It's basically like, a workout for your brain. They hook you up to this EEG machine and it measures your brainwave activity. And then you get feedback in real time about what your brain is doing. And the idea is that by practicing, you can actually learn to change your brainwave patterns. And it's been used to treat a lot of different conditions, from ADHD to anxiety to insomnia. And there's some really compelling research coming out about its effectiveness for treating trauma. Like, there's this woman, Sebrin Fisher. She's been using neurofeedback to treat severely disturbed adolescents, and she's had amazing results. And there's another story about this woman, Lisa, who had tried everything for her trauma, therapy, medication, nothing worked. But then she did neurofeedback and it changed her life. It's like it finally calmed her nervous system down. And the cool thing about neurofeedback is that it can be tailored to your specific needs. Like, if you're struggling with anxiety, they can target the brainwaves associated with anxiety. And if you're trying to improve focus, they can target the brainwaves associated with focus. It's really personalized medicine.
That's amazing. It's like we're really starting to understand the brain
Yeah.
in this whole new way. And it's giving us all these new tools for healing. And one of the things that your sources emphasized is the healing power of collective experiences,
Mm.
like things like theater.
Yeah. Theater is all about embodiment. It's about expressing emotions, telling stories, connecting with others. And for people who have experienced trauma, it can be a really powerful way to reclaim their voices and their bodies. And there are specific exercises that can be used in theater to help people process trauma. Like, there's this thing called mirroring, where you basically just mirror each other's movements, and it can help people to get in tune with each other on a really deep level. And the act of performing, it can be really transformative. Like, there's a story in one of your sources about a young woman who was really anxious, and she was cast as Ophelia in a play, and she was terrified, but she did it. And she said it was the most liberating experience of her life.
It's like by stepping outside of herself, by embodying this character, she was able to access a part of herself that she didn't even know was there.
Right.
So where do we go from here? What the future of trauma treatment?
Well, neuroscience is giving us more and more insights into how trauma affects the brain. And that's helping us to develop more targeted and effective treatments. And we're also learning a lot about prevention, how to support families, how to create trauma-sensitive schools. And there's this really powerful example from South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was basically this huge process of truth-telling and forgiveness after apartheid. And it was based on this concept called Ubuntu, which is basically the idea that we're all interconnected. We're all part of one human family. And that's something that we're really starting to understand on a scientific level. Like, our brains are wired for connection, and trauma, it disrupts that connection. And that's why it's so important to create a society that's trauma-informed, where we understand the impact of trauma and we create systems of support that help.